Today's defenders are operating in some of the most dynamic and demanding environments that we've seen. The infrastructure of the modern enterprise has evolved dramatically. It's no longer confined to four walls and a rack of servers. Right? Securing the perimeter isn't as straightforward as it once was, because the perimeter itself has more or less faded into the ether, right? Or perhaps contorted itself into something far less defined. Right? The lines have blurred. These days, our attack surface is everywhere, right? In the cloud, on endpoints scattered across the globe, right? Across different software as a service platforms or different edge devices, of course, mobile devices and remote workstations, right? Organizations today are not just connected, but they're always on, right? And adversaries know this. Because at the same time, the adversaries targeting these systems have also evolved, right? They're faster, they're more persistent, and far more motivated than ever before. However, as we'll learn, the saying of old habits die hard really rings true for the attacker, right? Attackers are often reluctant to change their ways of doing something, especially something that they've been doing for a long time, right? And so many of the core techniques that they rely on today, in some cases, trace back decades, right? We sort of have a modern threat landscape built upon familiar foundations. And we'll talk much more about sort of that interesting paradox as we get introduced to threat hunting and threat intelligence. Now, since 2010, Mandiant has provided statistics and analysis of the threats that they've observed in the previous year's incident response investigations. And I often find this is a fantastic resource to sort of retrospect on how real-world attacks are playing out and ultimately what's changing year to year, right? We can almost think of it like Spotify Wrapped, but for cybersecurity threats. And this report is called M-Trends, and the most recent Mandiant M-Trends report from 2025 makes this painfully clear. Attackers are taking advantage of every opportunity that they can get, right? Whether it's a cloud misconfiguration, or an unpatched device, or maybe a vulnerable piece of software, or if it's a stolen set of credentials, right? Or maybe just a distracted user in the environment. Attackers are taking advantage of everything that they can. And they're organized and stealthy. And unless we can get ahead of them, well, they're going to win every time. Right? And as we talked about, modern organizations operate across hybrid environments, right? That means they have a mix of, again, on-prem servers, maybe AWS infrastructure, maybe they're using Azure AD or Microsoft Entra ID, different third-party applications. Right? We have remote employees using personal laptops or, in some cases, unmanaged mobile devices, and scary enough to think much more that we might not even be aware of. And we also have public-facing web apps, right? Or different APIs, or perhaps VPN gateways and different edge devices that all help to make up our attack surface. Users are constantly changing. Devices get added and removed every day. We have system updates and different integrations that might break over time. Accounts can get created and often never cleaned up, right? Or the permissions or privileges that they were once given were never sort of removed. And what this means for attackers is opportunity. And this course was built to face that reality head on. You're not here to simply pick up a shiny set of tools, but we want to develop the instincts and the mindset to find evil in these high consequence environments. And so, who exactly are these adversaries? And the reality is they come in all forms, right? We really have somewhat of a spectrum here. On one end, you have these sort of run-of-the-mill, inexperienced attackers, maybe using public tools and exploits that they've downloaded from a repository or a forum, or what the industry commonly likes to refer to as script kiddies. And usually, they're a lot more smash and grab and opportunistic with their approach, right? Maybe not as concerned with making noise or leaving traces. In fact, they might simply just be ignorant to what traces they are leaving because of their inexperience. On the other hand, you have the advanced persistent threat groups, right? These nation-state actors sometimes backed by governments to conduct espionage, or maybe sabotage and destruction in cyber warfare. And these types of attacks are a lot more targeted and a lot more meticulously planned operations that have specific objectives. And in the middle, You have very commonly ransomware gangs, right? This sort of idea of ransomware as a service that has really taken off in the past years, right? Different criminal organizations or even things like insider threats. And as we've seen recently, an increasing number of state sponsored workers posing as legitimate employees. In particular, we've seen a few recent campaigns associated with North Korean IT contractors operating under false identities. Now, even though it seems like the list of threat actors keeps growing, their behavior once inside of the network is often predictable. Right? They operate in similar ways. They use similar tools, and they make similar mistakes. Right? This is where defenders gain an advantage, because these threat actors, right, their tactics and techniques and their tools are very well tracked. And this is what we refer to as threat intelligence, and really just understanding your adversary, who they are, how they operate, and ultimately what they want on our network. And this intelligence helps us forecast and ultimately respond better, right? We can focus our efforts on known techniques and known behaviors and high-value targets, right? And in 2024, over half the groups that Mandiant tracked were financially motivated, right? They were after data and extortion money or stealing cryptocurrency, right? Or stealing secrets or credentials or intellectual property for more or less black market sales. Around 8% were espionage actors, like APT-28 out of Russia, or commonly known as Fancy Bear, or APT-41 out of China, or APT-44, which is the Russian-backed Sandworm team, which has been linked to some of the most destructive cyber attacks in history, including NotPetya and the Ukraine electric power infrastructure blackouts. And a small number, around 2%, were more or less hacktivists or maybe ideologically motivated groups. But again, no matter their motivation and backing, they all tend to behave in similar ways once inside the network. Right? They look for credentials. They look for lateral movement paths. They look for data to steal or systems to disrupt. Right? This is how the modern adversary operates. To accomplish any kind of goal, there's certain things that the adversary needs to do once they make their way into the network. Right? They're almost never going to land where they need to be when they get their initial foothold. And so they're going to need to find ways to move around the network and expand their influence. Right? Which means they'll have to look for credentials, because they're going to need credentials to move around. Right? They're going to want to persist, and so we can expect them to implant some kind of backdoor or a persistence mechanism. Right? And we could keep going through the kill chain, but again, we'll get to that in more detail in due time. But this means that we, as defenders, can rely on a common set of tools and techniques to find them, regardless of who they are. Another characteristic of the modern adversary is that they're not always bringing their own malware. Right? Instead, they often prefer to use legitimate tools that are already present in the environment, which is a tactic known as living off the land. Rather than deploying new binaries that might trigger antivirus or EDR alerts, they much rather prefer to use legitimate, trusted tools, oftentimes intended for administrators to administrate the network. We can think of built-in Windows utilities like PowerShell, WMI, RDP, BitsAdmin, CertUtil, RunDLL32, right? All of these different binaries that can be abused. And not to mention all of the remote monitoring and management tools out there that are abused all the time, right? Tools like AnyDesk or TeamViewer, oftentimes Screen Connect or Atera are frequently seen in modern intrusions, right? These tools are legitimate. They're signed. They're often allow listed, which gives adversaries a very low friction way to execute commands or download payloads, or perhaps move laterally and escalate privileges or persist in the environment. Right? And so we're going to spend some time understanding and finding malicious uses of these living off the land techniques because they can really increase the capabilities of attackers in our network. And so we could keep dissecting the M-Trends report here, and I do encourage you to read through the entire thing. But I think Mandiant's core message is clear. While attackers are becoming more capable, so can we as defenders. There are some signs of hope in the M-Trends report, and we'll talk about dwell time later on. but I believe it to be partly a reflection of organizations becoming more proactive. Right? The organizations that succeed are the ones who know how attackers operate and know how to find evil before it escalates. And that's really what this class is about, helping you become part of that effort or part of that solution. To hunt, respond, and analyze at the level that modern threats demand.